began with Parker ladies in the back row, and their father's exhibition. We've had one for each show since. As I'm limited in my public speaking, I'm going to turn Brian over to introduce our speakers.
Hi, Brian Washburn. This is number 4 in the Artist Conversation series for Washburn Gallery. I want to introduce to you, starting with Tony Stankiewicz, Peter Stankiewicz, sons of Richard Stankiewicz, who helped us get this show together. They are the holders of Richard's work. I also want to introduce Emmie Donadio, who wrote the catalog for the Addison show in Andover at Phillips Academy exhibition. In 2003, she wrote the lead essay, Miracle of the Scrap Heap, right? In the Scrap Heap?
Miracle in the Scrap Heap, I believe.
So anyway.
Miracle on the Scrap Heap?
On the Scrap Heap. It's part of the Scrap Heap.
The
Anyway.
book is in the back.
Where's part of the Scrap Heap? And anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Emmie Donadio.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Well, first of all, let me say what a thrill it is to be here. It's a really nice, intimate group. I don't think any of you needs to be introduced to Richard Stankiewicz, who's been a family name in our family for well over 35 to 40 years. Stankiewicz first came into my consciousness when I was working at the Washburn Museum and Sculpture Garden in New York before it moved to Washington, D.C. And I did a lot of research on the sculpture in that collection. And I also was in New York during a number of exhibitions of Richard's work, but I didn't really become familiar with it until I was organizing an exhibition of Vermont artists and visited the Zabriskie Gallery. And I'm, saying a shout out to Deborah Eigen, who told me at the time that someone should really be working on Richard Stankiewicz, and I think I said no one is. And then I took it on as a doctoral thesis project, which I finished a few decades later. And in the process met Anthony and Peter and their mother, who were both all extremely generous and allowed me access to early work and diaries and private notebooks of the artist. And let me just say that the Archives of American Art has a very wonderful collection of papers of Richard Stankiewicz, and that those became important to me too. But I don't think I have to introduce the artist to you in the sense that you don't know where he comes from. But on the other hand, that's sort of what I'd like to do. I'd like to fit these works into a historical context, both in the general art history of the 20th century and in the artist's work. For one thing, Richard Stankiewicz sort of comes between Picasso, if you will, and then David Smith, who uses found objects in his constructed steel objects, particularly the Agricola series, which has farm implements in it. And then Robert Rauschenberg and the whole explosion of works of art called assemblage, or assemblage in the American version. And Richard Stankiewicz actually was taught art formally by Hans Hofmann, and then in New York in the 1940s, and then by Asaf Zadkin in Paris in 1950, where he lived for about 9 months, and also had been trained. Well, I'm going to get into that later. After his studies with Zadkin and Hofmann, he was more or less on a track perhaps to be more interested in painting than sculpture. But in Zadkin's studio in Paris, he started making sculptures out of wire with plaster. And they owed a lot in their imagery perhaps to surrealist insects or to works by Giacometti. They were very long and thin, attenuated. They were constructed of attenuated wire with plaster applied, and Zadkin called them snot sculptures because he hated Giacometti. He told Stankiewicz this would never do. But nevertheless, Stankiewicz persisted making these works and also made some works in terracotta, which are illustrated in this catalog of which we spoke. But those works in terracotta are largely destroyed.
Oh, no, we've got quite a few.
Okay, well, that's why that's why Peter and Anthony are here. Just, tell us what's coming after this exhibition. So, those works gave way to his discovery, as he said, of iron and steel shards in a garden. He was living on Bond Street in the same building, sort of accidentally, with Jean Dubuffet, who was in the United States in 1950-51, to work on his on a lecture that he was giving at Chicago, and he lived in New York, and it happened that he was living in the same apartment building as Richard Stankiewicz and Jean Follett, with whom Richard Stankiewicz was associated early on from the 40s until the late 50s. Jean Follett, an artist in her own right, is less well known for a variety of reasons, but one of them is her works haven't survived, as well as Richard Stankiewicz's. Stankiewicz's work, he wrote in an article that was wildly and widely quoted, came about when he was going to build up a garden in the back of his apartments on Bond Street. And he started digging up the ground and finding shards of old rusted steel things that he threw against a wall, and then stopped all of a sudden, and the sunlight was hitting these things, and he said that those things were looking at him. And he had the sense that he knew immediately what he had to do. He had to get a book called How to Make Sculpture in Your Spare Time and Learn to Weld. How to make sculpture in your how to learn to weld in your spare time and make sculpture out of these objects. So this is probably a myth, because there's evidence that he knew how to weld before that, and there is no book called How to Make Sculpture in a Week, how to learn to weld in a week. No book. I checked everywhere to see what book that would be. And so Stankiewicz started putting a lot of stuff together. And the stuff was burners from stoves. I have a list of the kinds of things he used, because if you're a poet, and a lot of poets write about art. So if you're a poet, these parts have a lot of resonance. He used what was actually broken down, cast off junkyard machinery, rusted plumber's fittings, automobile parts, stove burners, tanks, lead pipes, toilet balls, elbow joints, nipple assemblies, roller skates, rifles, doorknobs, nails, wire, whatever he found. And he was a terrific composer, and he welded these objects together in welds that one of his junk dealers, whom he met in New York in the early 50s, said were chicken shit welds. That he came to the first show that Stankiewicz had in 1952 at the Hansa Gallery, and his junk dealer said, you don't know how to weld. But Stankiewicz actually did probably know how to weld. Even then, he had gone to a technical high school in Detroit where he learned how to be a mechanical draftsman. He knew a huge amount about machinery. I'll let you talk perhaps about that. But my guess is he could figure things out and know exactly what kind of motion any constituent part of his works might have made. And he started out making personifications or personae out of these shards. And the little girl in the window, the little sculpture that's on the list, untitled, that it's a little girl. She has wire braids, and she's standing sway-backed, if you can see her from the side. Pardon me?
It's in the brochure, too.
Yes, and it's in the brochure, right, which is right. Anyway, this is the kind of thing he started doing. And there was an impulse to caricature. And what he thought he was doing and what he wanted to be doing was bringing dead material to life. As a product of Hans Hofmann and Asaf Sadkin, who both taught that art should be alive, and there should be a spiritual dimension and a resonance and content in art that should transfer from the object to the person regarding it. Stankiewicz brought these dead materials to life by putting them together, often in configurations of figures. So a lot of his figures are like secretary, soldier, tank people, totems. A lot of his works are figurative, and then a lot of them are also very abstract. And what we see in this wonderful exhibition, which looks beautiful in this space, what we see here is work that he created, I believe, as early as 1954, where the little girl in the window, I think, is from, early on in his career, through about the very late 60s. 69, is there something from 70, perhaps?
This one on the wall, I think, is from the 70s.
That one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that one back there.
That one I thought was 69, but okay. So Stankiewicz was using recycled parts. And you're right, of course you're right. The frame, all right, so Stankiewicz was putting together a lot of little objects into sculptural form, and the works garnered him a terrific amount of press attention in the mid-50s. He was notorious for making art out of junk. And Sidney Geist, who wrote the first review of his exhibition at the Hansa Gallery, called it Miracle in the Scrap Heap. That was the name of the article that became the name of the exhibition. But subsequently in his career, first of all, the art world changed. People were interested in sculptures that had figuration to a certain extent. And by 1968 and 69, conceptual art and minimalism were in sort of full sway. And he started making works like the ones at the far back, at the left, with found prefabricated steel. And he composed using prefabricated steel elements rather than junk objects. And after 1969-70, when he went to Australia, where he was given assistance and the use of a steel foundry in Sydney, he actually made welded pieces from fabricated steel, some of them as large as 18 feet high, and perhaps his largest work, this might be the largest in diameter, this is a 70s work that's in Albany, at SUNY Albany on loan. But he made a very large 18-foot-high work that's in the National Gallery in Australia, in Melbourne. And because he constructed these huge welded pieces with assistance, and he learned a lot about metallurgy on the job there in Sydney, Australia. Many of those works have come back to the States. But when he got back to Massachusetts, where he had moved from New York, I'm skipping the biography to talk about the sculpture. But I could ask questions if I'm leaving things unclear. But when he came back to the States after Australia, he was teaching at SUNY Albany. And then he ordered and started working at the Nash Foundry, which is in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and started ordering frames like the square, rectangular frame that you see in that late 70s piece. And he would, at the end of his life, start composing relief sculptures with the frame around them, so that they, in a way, they looked pictorial. The other sculpture that he made throughout his career, and as you can see here, most of them are meant to be seen from four directions. Early on in his career, he photographed every work that he made from four directions, leaving no stone unturned, really, so that when we've organized some exhibitions, if we had access to his own picture of the work, we knew what the frontal perspective of it might be. A good example of that is the work in the far left in the back, which I just love. to me, that looks like a head. And if you're to the left of it, it looks like a face. From the side, you look into the cogs and the gears that wind up the brain. And it's got a little base that looks like shoulders. And it's just a wonderful evocation, I think, of a head. A lot of Stankiewicz's works were heads. The work at the left that has a round shape, I call those the tunnel heads. He did a large series of those. They referred, to my mind, to a work by Juan Gonzalez, who did a head called The Tunnel, which is a very famous welded piece from the 40s or the 30s, I think, 40s. And Stankiewicz did a very large series of these, and they're all filled with all kinds of bits of junk. So that, you know, it's like looking into the head of someone. You know, and screws and nuts and bolts and God knows what is in there. You maybe don't even want to know. And those are fascinating. And another work that's typical of the kind of imagination that he brought to his work is this one at the side over here, which is actually a dumpster. It was connected by these sort of uplifted, praying hands to some kind of belt. What's a belt? A conveyor belt, right? And then it would dump its contents and move on. But he sort of turned it on its head, with its arms up like this, which sort of looks like a praying figure and all kinds of art, with a little pinhead. And I think he probably welded some of the textures on the top of it to elaborate upon it. But mainly it's a found object, an assisted ready-made, if you will, in the way Duchamp assisted his ready-mades. So I think that's an introduction to the work, and I guess before I ask Peter and Anthony to talk about Richard, I would just like to suggest a few things about the content of all of his work, whether it was the late geometric abstractions, which are very large and constructed, or the assemblage works, which often have personalities and they're anthropomorphic, a lot of them. Stankiewicz wanted to bring dead things to life. That was definitely a leitmotif when he spoke about his work. There was a lot of faith, I think, buried in that. Also, the skill set that he brought to it had a lot to do with his education in Detroit at Cass Technical High School, which prepared people in the 1930s to go into the automotive industries. So Stankiewicz knew mechanical draftsmanship. He made his living in the 50s, and particularly in the 60s after he left New York. He made his living as a patent draftsman. So there's no way that he didn't know how something could be made to move. I mean, a lot of his sculpture looks like it's ready to move, and it suggests movement. And as a kid, he was also very much interested in cartooning and caricatures. So that also, I think, comes across in the figurative sculpture. And then, you know, what really, I think, makes him a very significant figure is the fact that he used degraded, cast off, not valuable materials to make art with a capital A. And that has probably become, it was, Alan Capro prophesied in 1958, Capro, the founder of Happenings and Art from Everywhere, that the new art, thanks to Jackson Pollock, very important article in 1958 in Art News, the new art was going to be made of dirty socks, paint cans, things you find on the street. It was going to include sound, smell. It was going to be the art of the streets. It was going to be everyday objects. And those were going to be the new materials of art. And of course, we've all lived long enough to see that that's certainly become the case when art is made out of anything and everything. And you put it together and you put it in an art gallery and it's art. And some of Stankiewicz's sculptures you run the risk of not looking like art if you don't know what they are, like those of perhaps outsider artists or naive artists. And a lot of interest in those artists has been in museums and galleries lately. Show at the National Gallery in Washington last year included a lot of work. I think it's interesting that a number of the artists who make work of these kinds of materials are often African American, and they're sort of making fun of themselves by using irons or chains to make some of their works. And I think there's a way in which Stankiewicz's art, by choosing rusted, used material, was somewhat self-deprecating. I mean, it's part of his personality, I think, to not take himself too seriously. And that being said, a lot of his work has a terrific amount of humor, and also very deep human resonance, which I think speaks to us in these works, which aren't just things. You know, they all have some kind of resonance and a presence, and that's what he sought to make.
Do you want to mention Leger?
I could mention Leger. Leger was also, Richard went originally to Paris to study with Leger, but Leger didn't speak English and was very snotty, evidently. And what he wrote about it was that nobody was learning anything there. It was just sort of a money-making thing for Leger, because he could get paid by the American government for all these artists to go over on the GI Bill and study with him. So he thought Leger was very cynical. But on the other hand, Leger is really interesting too because of his mechanical tubism and the kind of cubist style of his own work. He too was interested in mechanics. So there's a similarity there, but it didn't work out for Leger to be his teacher. Zadkin, on the other hand, was fluent in English and many other languages, and had students from all over the world. So it was a much more international setting.
Yeah, I was thinking of the tubism thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, remember, I've seen, I think, some writings where he complained about,
Where your father complained about Leger.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to ask Anthony and Peter to talk about the man himself, because they knew him.
Yeah, that's fine. My growing up, of course, we grew up in the country. My father moved up into the country in 1961, and they couldn't have been any more of a rural setting. They moved up into a honeymooner's cottage that actually doubled as a hunting cottage, without any heat, running water, any kind of, I think they didn't have initially electricity, but then they did, and pretty much pioneering the whole, and they moved up in the winter. The first winter was one of the hardest. My mother, Patricia, was, really a rugged person too, and really must have loved my father a lot, because it was pretty tough going in the beginning, I'm sure. But he described moving out of the city as a necessary, he thought that artists in the city got what they got, and when they became fluent in speaking a language, whatever that language was, in their art, that the city became a distraction. And so moving up to the country was really to continue the work that he was doing here, but with fewer distractions. I was born in 1963, so what I know of my father growing up, I remember being 4 and 5 and 6. I I remember working as early as that on constructions in the shop. Not so much sculpture, but you know, at that time I wanted to plow for plowing snow, and I remember building this plow that you push, and you know, it was functional to some degree as long as you had somebody strong enough to push it. But there were no motors or any of that stuff. But I do remember very early on talking about, I remember sawing a piece of wood, and I had this notion at some point halfway through the wood, and I said it to my father. I said, you know, sometimes I feel like kind of sad. I think I must have been 8 years old. And he said, why is that? I said, well, when I'm sawing through the wood, I feel like it's alive and I'm killing it or I'm hurting it in some way. And I remember his reaction to that was he was pretty astounded that I came up with it. And it was very similar to some of the ways that he felt, I think, about the works that he was doing. I think the idea that some of these pieces that were assembled into a you know, a configuration, he was actually constructing one piece at a time, in what in his mind was almost, he described it as like a messenger, a being of some kind that somehow connected this sort of surreal world of you know, I don't know if you call it, you know, it's almost like Twilight Zone-ish, it sounds like, but you know, that it was a connection to something from the real world and the world just underneath, and that these beings did become alive at some point. And he talked about, and I always thought this was a great story, and my father was a very good storyteller. He always talked about you know, the construction of a piece of sculpture, and he thought that it was kind of simple and in a way kind of stupid, because you know, you start by building a base, because that's where you have to start, and then you have to attach something to it, because what else are you going to do? And then you're presented one piece at a time with this terrible crushing problem of what to do about this first piece, and then the next one that's going to somehow get attached to it. And he talks about it almost like, he compares it to a billy goat jumping from one emergency to another until it's finished and it's solved. And you know, you compound the problem one piece at a time until you stand back and you can't improve it in any way, and then it's done. And he always talked about how he never used to use any kind of drawings or any kind of design, that he tried it once and it didn't work. And whatever he did as a drawing never really had anything to do with the final sculpture anyway. And so it was always his way of sort of improvisational creation. This one piece at a time kind of construction. And you know, in the bigger pieces where it actually required a factory to build, I think it was probably very difficult for him to let, you know, the factory workers in and to have them be a part of the process, because I think it probably somehow got in the way of his what he was used to in terms of the way he created. But you know, some of the bigger pieces in Australia required cranes, and it required workmen, and it required people who knew how to do a constructional weld similar to a bridge, because it had to be that strong. And so they had certain types of welding, and you know, it had to be professionally put together. And I remember working in his studio. You know, I used to help every now and again putting the pieces together, or from time to time I did make my own sculptures, so we'd be working alongside each other. I remember him getting really aggravated with me because I left the studio in kind of a mess or a disarray, and I can totally relate and identify with that today, because I have an 18-year-old son who does the same things to me. It's an unbelievable aggravation. not know where your tools are and to not have them where they belong. But I do remember he used to say, and in one of the videos that I have, and I might play it in a minute here, he used to say that he thought that the way you did something mattered. And he said if it didn't matter whether you did it this way or that way, then it didn't matter whether you did it at all. And I always remember how ordered his studio was, and even in the midst of a creative process, it always seemed organized in a way that it didn't seem like a clutter. You know, and my father didn't work the way my son works. It doesn't look like a bomb went off. It really, most of it looks, you know, like everything it has a place and everything's in its place. And yeah, well, I'm gonna see if this works, because one of the things I was hoping to do is to have him speak a few things in his own voice, because he's alive and breathing and talking, and you can hear him. Everything went off, so I don't know if it's going to work. We'll find out in a minute here. Okay. Well, it might work and it might not.
Into the country and to find out that you could actually get food out of the ground, out of cow manure and dirt and composted garbage, and generate some kind of food that you always bought in a market. It's a revelation. It's kind of a wonderful thing to experience, and so it's an enjoyable thing to do. And the reading and the music and walking about and so on, I didn't see why that's interesting at all. Everybody works a certain amount and then does other things a certain amount, and you just do what you feel like doing. Partly because they're not that interested in it, and partly because they don't have the time. They live with their mother over in Pittsfield the week, and they're with me only on weekends. Too brief a time. They have their homework to do, and the other stuff they're interested in the garden is the least of their interests. Peter draws a lot. Anthony once in a while gets inspired to work in the shop and make a sculpture. And I don't push them in any direction. I don't believe in it. And anyway, the world might be one of them. And why should I change it into something else? Fabrication of sculpture usually is a pretty slow and laborious process. The idea emerges rather slowly. There's a lot of noodling around, just doing work. 99% is mechanical work. And I don't like this idea of inspiration. It sounds so 19th century romantic. I believe in something like the psychological idea of the unconscious. But you can't work on that, because if you bring it up to daylight, it's not unconscious anymore. It no longer has its power. So I like to work on mental levels, when you might have an idea and you might concentrate on techniques and mechanical problems, and you might involve yourself with formal requirements, composition, movement, balance, all of that garbage. And while you're doing your duties in that direction, maybe something else will ride in on top of it without your willing it. And if it happens, then it's good. I'm not a very good spectator of other people's work, because, see, I'm in the trade and I'm a meddler, and when I look at somebody else's work, I immediately feel I wouldn't have done it that way. I would have changed this part or done the other thing the other way, and I mentally reconstruct things after my own fashion, and this is a great barrier to appreciation and sympathy with the work. You see. So when people ask me what do I think of somebody's work, I generally avoid the question because I've been rebuilding it in my case. The way it should be.
Thank you.
My father used to talk about there being 3 types of materials that he would get at the junkyard. The first is, he'd pick up a piece of metal and it would be so uninteresting, but maybe useful as, material to build a base out of or something of similar form. And then there'd be, on the other extreme, something that is so interesting and has so much of a character of its own that he might leave it blessedly alone, he would say, because it's no way to improve upon it. And then, in between those 2 extremes would be some of those found objects that you were talking about that he found in his garden, and many of them were unrecognizable and probably wouldn't have stood alone in any way, but he could see where, given a little bit of effort in one direction or another, they would come alive all on their own. And so our growing up in the country, we certainly had plenty of space, and outside the studio it became kind of a junkyard all by itself. He talked about having enough stuff on hand, and he would go to the local junkyards to get materials and just have it on hand, because it was like having if you were a painter, you'd have a palette of colors, and you don't know exactly how you're going to use the piece, but you want to have it on hand, and not, not have, not having it around would make it more difficult. I'm kind of better when it comes to talking about, my father. I'm kind of better with remembering stories, and some of them will come to me, I'm sure, when Peter starts to talk. But my recollection of my father was, most of what I learned in terms of organization in my shop, and most of what I know about building things, the influence I think that I got from him had more to do with, again, the way things look, the way they're made, and that it matters. Even if I'm just building a utilitarian plow to plow a field, it matters how the form and how it looks, and the way it's constructed. So, to this day, even though living upstate, I live with, or live among people from the country. I have a metal shop, and I couldn't imagine not having one. I couldn't imagine not having the pieces of metal, and I'm not an everyday sculptor, and I'm using many of the tools still in the shop that were in his shop. I have his welder, and I have his grinder, and I have a lot of his tools, and I feel very close in a spiritual way to him when I'm in that shop. There are times when I almost feel his presence, and I don't think that's a silly notion. I do feel that he's around. And I was saying, coming over here today, that having an opening like this and having a talk like this, it's a wonderful thing, really, because it does seem to bring him back to life even after all these years. And he died when my brother and I were very young. We were only, I think we were 16 or 17, and I was just out of the service on leave. I might have been 19, and so it's been a very long time. He didn't really get to see us as boys, as men. He only knew us as boys. So he died at 60. I thought it was too young, and I miss him. So that's my talk.
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind with this show is the selection that Joan made. I think is a really great selection. There's not a million sculptures left in the estate, but what Joan chose out of what was available, I think, was really good. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
the first word that comes to me about the work that we see here is the strangeness of it. And I think strangeness in a good way. I haven't seen most of the work up close for a while. My brother is generously storing it at his place, so I don't see it all that often. And to see it brought out and to encounter it again is, it's always kind of a surprise, even if I've seen the pieces many times before over the decades. I think it's not quite like seeing them for the first time, but it's to be reminded of something you've forgotten, of the particular personality that the pieces have and the various qualities that they're. Who was the critic, Joan, who wrote in the Times the other day?
Well, Hyman.
Right. I think the first sentence of what he wrote was that the pieces can't be summarized, words to that effect. And I think that is a really important point, that you can't, the sculptures are so, I think, complex at their best, and there are many layers that you can't really summarize or define what's going on.
So there was someone
I don't think they can really be represented, and I think that's actually a really good compliment that you could give to a piece of art, is that it can't be represented or translated or quantified. Every time I encounter that quality again in the work, it makes me think of how good it is and how hard it is to do that. For an artist to get beyond what can really be understood, I guess I could put it that way. And you end up with something which exists, I guess, in an unquantifiable way, for lack of a more articulate way to say it. I think that's really a great achievement, and I think that maybe that's what every artist is aiming for, is to do something that couldn't be any other way in the world. That's the main thought I have about this show and the work.
The critic came twice.
Yeah, you were telling me.
Yeah.
He seemed to be taken in by the work,
Yeah.
apparently.
Some of them don't come at all.
Too bad for them.
One of the things I forgot to say, and we talked about it before we sat down here, my father said on numerous occasions in all of these tapes I've been listening to, that the main event was the doing of the piece, the making of the piece. And the piece was sort of an, almost a byproduct of the action and the act of making a piece. And that's what he was driven to do. Then, once the piece was built, and a lot of people thought this was kind of a terrible thing to say, but he didn't care whether it was going to last 2 years or 200 years, and it wasn't really up to him anymore anyway. And he always used to talk about how much he appreciated, or he at least recognized, that these pieces are not going to last forever. He talks about in the very end of one of the movies that, you know, he's going to die, we're all going to die, and sometimes people's pieces will die too. And he likes this idea of the piece sort of mimicking life and having a life of its own. And that's something he always enjoyed in the work. But it didn't hit me until today. What he really meant was that the actual art and the thing that he was driven to do was the act of doing it and what happens afterwards. He said he didn't ever really remember making the piece. He only remembered what he was doing around the time when the piece was being made. He remembers the people he was with. He remembers perhaps where he was living at the time, but very little about making the piece itself. And I've noticed that about true artists, people that I consider to be artists with integrity, that they seem to go into this sort of trance, and they build or make or paint or do whatever it is that they do, and they don't really always remember, you know, and all of a sudden they stand back and it's done. And I can identify with that, because the worst thing you could do for my father was to go down and interrupt him in his studio, you know, because he was quite literally in the middle of something, and it would frustrate him to no end. And I remember being a kid and doing that, you know, and I did it far too many times. I don't know if I was trying to get his attention or whatever, but he spent a great deal of time in the studio, and I think he should have been spending more time with me, you know, at that time. So I would probably intentionally, you know, interrupt. But yeah, that was the one thing I wanted to point out is and I never realized it until quite literally today, that the main event was the making of the piece. And he said, you know, there was a critical time when he was feeling, you know, put upon, and the world wasn't doing right by him. And he said he had a very important friend talk to him and say, you know, if you're doing your work and you can be happy doing it in the studio, you can be happy making the work, and you can know without any doubt that not one person is ever going to appreciate it or like it, and you can still do it. You'll be okay. But he talks about how, you know, if you're in it for the fame and the fortune, you're almost guaranteed to be, you know, a very unhappy, you know, miserable person, because, and he also talks about how he was always envious of the poet, because you get a scrap of paper and a pencil and you're in business. You don't have to import all this heavy metal material.
Does anybody have any questions?
I just want to say that kept indoors, the work actually will last forever. Don't be afraid.
Yes.
Thank you guys very much. It's really, really insightful. I saw your dad's work a couple of years ago up at Jones Gallery when they were up on, I think it's 52nd Street. It really blew me away. And I really liked the analogy. I love, my dad was a folk artist, and I love folk art. I love outsider art. And I think what I really, really, really genuinely love about them, what you also brought up, is this old rusted, tarnished, kind of beaten up. You know, a few artists, Noah Burvoy, who used things from, I think it was the '67 Watts riots, who went out to the desert and sculpted, and Huck was Golden, and a few other guys that not everybody needs to be educated, you know, but great artists, but they use a lot of more or less old, rusted, tarnished things that were beaten up and abused. And it's like the first time I saw works of your dad. The ones that really, really, really resonated with me were like these old rusted, beaten up, they aren't as figurative, and they're just much more, you can tell the sense of humor in them. But I like when they're very much, much, much more minimal, you know, and it's really, I remember the first time I saw them, I mean, I'm without a doubt, you know, out of my generation and a kindred soul, you know, as far as nostalgia and things like that. And it's like, you know, I look at works like this and it's just, you know, being an artist also and a sculptor, they're just really, really special. Like you guys were talking about, it's ironic, I had to be on Bond Street picking up paint this morning, and I'm on Bond Street, and I'm just sitting there looking at these buildings, and it, you know, I can't say that you guys are from New York or whatever, but it's, you know, it's just the city, everything, the environment, everything has changed so insanely. And it's like I look at these pieces and I look at contemporary art nowadays, and I think to myself, what's missing from it? Like this room, ironically, should be filled. This is New York City with young artists in here learning about how important this work is. And it's like I'm probably the only guy in here. Yeah. And it just goes to show you the context of really, really, really important work, highly respected by some very, 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 you know, highbrow intellectuals who have been in the business. I mean, Joan's a warrior, who's, you know, who I still, you know, thank God it's like presenting these guys that came from this period in time that are now receiving the attention that they so much deserve, you know. And it's, I just remember, man, a couple of years ago, like I saw some in the older works, and you sometimes say the hit factor, and it's like that work to me at the time when I had seen it for the first time, it just had the it factor. And I just want to say that and express it because I just there's something really special about them, and it's just you don't work can go up in all these walls in these neighborhoods in Chelsea, it can be sold for whatever it is, but there's certain things that really they are from the heart, they are constructed, they are dug up, built up, broken down, they are what they are. But they're successful, and they're effective, and they're memorable, and that's what your dad accomplished, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, oh, go ahead, please. Well, I was just going to respond, and I was just going to say, I think that, you know, something that, like you described, it's truly remarkable, even back then, you know, last the ages, like, you know, it happens in music. There's popular music, there's, you know, I was listening the other night to a concerto by Mozart, and Concerto 21, and I had it with the headphones on because I was so moved by it, you know, and I couldn't believe it. I put it on Facebook. I said, you have to listen to this. But it's so funny because even today, you know, you can look at the work and it does feel like it holds its own no matter how long time goes by.
I'm not sure exactly how to put this. This is a very helpful conversation, partly because the wit of the work is sort of immediately evident, but it doesn't really account for the effect that it has, which is, and this is what I'm struck by, how moving it is, how much the quality of feeling in the work. It goes beyond this sort of art historical references. I mean, you can see the drive-by associations in a lot of the pieces, but there's a quality of feeling in it that is very hard to explain, and it doesn't attach itself to other works that are presumably like this. Chamberlain is an example for me of the difference between, I mean, to me, those are very, very different projects, and one of them, this work, reaches to a different level in although you could say that technically they have a lot in common. I don't mean to bash Chamberlain, but just to say that what's striking is this tragic dimension of the work. I mean, I until you talked about this today, I never could figure out why he didn't seem to care whether the works would stand or not. It's because ultimately this project is a redemptive project, right? I mean, he's taking things that people think are of no use, that they wouldn't pay any attention to, and he pays attention to them and puts them together in a way that compels you to pay attention to them. So it is redemptive in its impulse, but it also recognizes these are things whose time has passed, and that's true of people too. The time will come when their time will have passed. So the wit is kind of embraced by this larger, what I can only call tragic dimension. You see rusted machinery, you know that something happened there once in this place, but it doesn't happen there anymore. And I think that sense of how this reflects the human condition is really what I find kind of overwhelming about the work, and always have. But I wouldn't have thought of this until you talked about it today.
I think that's a good way to describe the work. I think the sense of tragedy might even be on the unconscious level most of the time looking at the work, and that might be one of the elements that's hard to ever describe. But I think the best art and the best music is tragic, actually. And to hear you say that you see that quality in the work, I think it's very illuminating to hear that. And it reminds me, someone wrote that totalitarian regimes have no sense of the tragic, that the idea is that you can live without tragedy ever catching you, and that you can make things perfect and you can define something that goes forever without flaws, and that you'll not come to a tragic end. But I think sane people actually understand that tragedy is always with us. Maybe I'm saying that a little too extreme way, but I think the tragic element is essential to human sanity, basically. I think you have to accept it.
Well, I think the dimensions that you and Anthony have brought to the discussion, thank you, get a lot at the content of the work, and it's no accident that the apples didn't fall far from the tree, as it were.
Any more questions? There's somebody in the back.
Yeah, I just, as someone who's seen the artist's work a lot over the years, because Peter and I have been artist colleagues since school in the late 80s, I just found this really insightful because I felt like I was looking at some of it in more simplistic terms than it actually is, like things like anthropomorphism and found object, and these kind of terms. I felt like I saw something a little bit beyond when you were talking about how, at the beginning, how the objects were talking to him when he first, made his breakthrough and decided he was going to use these things. And I think animism is what popped into my head, which is like one of the oldest forms of religion, and basically seeing inanimate objects as being imbued with a spiritual kind of quality. And I think today really kind of gave me a new insight on that level into what led to this work, and not just this, the other things that I've seen.
That's very much to the point. And the artist himself wrote, it was a really quite wonderful writer in some of his early notebooks, when when he was in the Aleutians, when he was in the Navy in World War II. He talks about how everything is alive. All you have to do is look.
There was something I was going to mention. I mean, we talk about the tragic side of life, and you know, my father always used to talk about the intensity of drive in an artist and the compulsion or impulsion to work, despite whatever the conditions around you might be. And you know, the bread and water artists of the 50s, he was from that era where he actually talks about going into a cafe to order a tea, because that's all he could afford, and you could get a refill on the tea bag and mix it with ketchup and it'd be tomato soup. And that's what he lived on for a long time before he was in the Hoffman School. He was here starving to death, quite honestly, and working. And how you can do all that, I don't know, but he was always working as far as I can remember. And we went through periods of time, he went through periods of time, very difficult time periods, and he worked through all of it. You know, he was also a teacher. He taught at SUNY Albany, and you know, he always used to say, you know, when it came to his students, that, you know, nobody can be made into an artist. He said being made into an artist is like being made into a fool. Everybody has to do it for themselves. So
he had a great sense of humor.
He could show people how materials are used. He can show people how to hold a paintbrush, but what you paint thereafter, you know. And sometimes somebody would take off and really, you know, excel. And the commentator asks, well, what do you do then? He says, you stand aside, you know. They've become, and there's nothing more you can do. So, you know, he was driven to do, and you know, some of the most successful artists, I think, are driven by either tragic events or having a dark past. He grew up in the Great Depression, where they lived in bank repossessed houses, and until the bank got to know where they were living, they were able to live there. And as soon as the bank would push them on, they'd move to the next house. And he has stories of jumping on freight trains and stealing a big hunk of coal so that they could have heat in their house. They had tough upbringing, you know, as a kid. So I think he was always sort of tortured by a lot of that stuff. Growing up in a house with 7 children, and their mother must have been, you know, a strong woman.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
It really was above and beyond.
Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming and helping us.
It's a privilege to hear you speak.
Absolutely.